Alice, thanks so much for joining me today, Matt. It's good
No,
to have you on the show.
no, thanks for having me on, Scott.
Yeah. Um, so without further ado, I sort of want to get into a few a few interesting topics, a bit eclectic, but we'll see where the conversation goes.
Sure.
I was reading one of the Substack emails that you sent out. I think it was like a week or two ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk about this term white supremacist. It gets thrown around a lot in America today, particularly with the Rittenhouse trial. I thought that was a particularly egregious instance of the term just being very freely used. And I mean, personally, I think it's horrible because there are real white supremacists, domestic terrorists out there. And I think a term like this should be reserved for them so that we can identify them.
Right.
um, um, so, I mean, I guess my question is this something of like a linguistic shift or a cultural shift in what does it mean that, terms like this are just sort of being thrown around in common discourse?
I think it's a cultural shift. It's also a an industry shift. So I talked about this with a couple of friends of mine who are also reporters. Um, once upon a time, we would have been afraid to use that word unless we had uh, something that we could show to a defamation attorney that would justify its use. So uh, again, the job once upon a time was you whenever you came across um, something that was potentially defamatory or libelous, that was when you needed your fact checkers. That was when you needed to talk to your lawyers, and you had to have something that you could show as backup before you describe somebody in a way that could affect their career, their lives, their marriages, whatever. I mean, all they have to do is show damage, um, from what you've written, and you can be in very serious career trouble. So when I first saw that Rittenhouse was being described as a white supremacist, I assumed there had to be be something there, because people in my generation, we would just never have written in that unless there was membership in a group that you could classify that way, and there isn't. There's just these vague cultural markers. He carries a gun that's kind of scary looking. He wore a green shirt. I don't think that's enough. I think you need more to go on than that. And
Right.
I think it's a very unfortunate development in media.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's not just with Rittenhouse. I tend to stay off of the Twitter sphere to the extent that I can anyway. But I think the liberty with which people just sort of throw around terms like Nazi, or even to a lesser degree misogynist or bigot or racist or homophobe or transphobe or whatever,
And
is
communists, to be fair, like that's yeah.
oh, absolutely. No.
Mhm.
On the right is very good at doing this as well. Of
Mhm.
labeling, calling calling progressives commies. Which is also I think a different strand of the same kind of issue. But I guess the question is why. I mean, we had, at least going back to the Rittenhouse thing, the president of the United States came out and said that this guy was a white supremacist. And it's like, if gold rusts, what will iron do? If we have the guy at the top
I
doing it.
know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
and and there's no standard until somebody sues and wins for doing that. I'm assuming there are going to be some lawsuits in this one, because um you know he's got some pretty clear. I mean, this is a textbook case of the kind of stuff that we were trained to avoid. And if there isn't, then it's going to continue, because and it's something that we started to see in 2016 when Trump started to have a lot of success. You started to see this kind of drift. So instead of race baiting which was a term that journalists used a lot, or racially tense. Suddenly, that became racist. Then racist became white supremacist. It was sort of like grade inflation, but for language, right?
Right.
And as you point out, like a lot of these words have concrete meanings that get watered down when you start applying them to lots and lots of people. So if you're suddenly describing everybody who voted for Donald Trump as a white supremacist, well, then what do you call Richard Spencer, right?
Right.
Or one of the, somebody who belongs to one of those groups. It just creates a problem. And I also think that the people in news media underestimate the amount of rage that inspires among people who get hit with that word. Like they don't rebound from it. They don't have a sense of humor about it. I don't think they should, frankly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's people who are just really being entirely too casual about that stuff.
Well, on the flip side of the coin, you could say that they are well aware of the damage that inspires, and they're interested in stirring up shit, for lack of a better word. If it bleeds, it leads, kind of thing.
Right, but I actually genuinely think that they're like I covered the Trump campaign, and I
Hmm.
was with all the reporters who were following Trump around, which was a very interesting and bizarre experience in
Yeah.
2015 and 2016, because we all had very different opinions about what was going on, what we were watching, and I was continually mystified by the degree to which the people who were covering Trump didn't understand where the anger was coming from. Like the people in the crowds hated us. Like Trump figured out early on that if he pointed to us, and the reporters are always standing on a riser, we're surrounded
Yeah.
by roast, we look like idiots.
Yeah.
He figured out early on that any insult he threw at us was going to work, and
Right.
there were all these hurt feelings among the press corps. Like, what's wrong with us? Why do they hate us so much? And they genuinely don't get it. Like and I would have these arguments with people and say, this just goes back a long way. It starts with the WMD thing, but mainly it's because of the caricatures we throw at the sort of dumb hayseed red state follower Republican who just has regressive views about everything. That caricature, which is sort
Right.
of it's just so common, and they think that that people aren't listening, or that it doesn't have an impact, which it does.
No, I mean, yeah, like I think one of the more sobering books that I read was Hillbilly Elegy, which sort of shed light on a lot of this. And then one of the things that I noticed is, I personally, I used to like Vice. I thought it was really cool, underground, like edgy, gonzo stuff. But now the sort of hayseed caricature that you've described is literally every single headline for them. And a lot of people do believe these are just sort of uneducated, bigoted, racist, old, fat white dudes with shotguns who hate everyone. and
Yeah,
and then they're shocked that something like Trump happens.
yeah,
So
and it's not just it's not just a bad caricature that is uninformed and comes from a place of not speaking to any of these people, but it's just illogical. Like when you think about a country as big as the United States, the variability in the population, it's going to be so unlikely that everyone is going to fit into this cookie cutter image that you have of um, a type of political character. People are very idiosyncratic in this country. It's very regional. Like their opinions come from all over, and oftentimes their positions are much more thought out than we give them credit for. Like I remember having this experience um in Utah during the campaign when Romney was running against Obama, and there was an argument about the Defense of Marriage Act and whether or not we should allow same-sex marriage. And there was this older couple that was talking about how they were against that. And I, like a typical New Yorker, I said, well, do you know any gay people? And they were so offended. They're like, yeah, we know lots of gay people. Like, that's not the issue. We've thought about this long and how we prayed about it. Like, and they went through this whole thing about how this was a very difficult decision for them. Like, they had to really, really work through, the doctrinaire side of it versus the emotional side of it versus the policy side. And so when you try to paint these people with a simplistic brush, it's inaccurate almost 100% of the time.
Right. I mean, I think the other thing that's important for us to remember is oftentimes we think of the caricaturing as something that, these terms used to mean something. Now they're a bit devoid of meaning, but that the left will throw at the right. But the right is quite good at caricaturing the left as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Calling
Well,
them,
but the problem is those caricatures work more often. Like, this new the new caricature of the kind of woke sort of leftist, and also the right-wing audiences are very attuned to the little differences between the various factions that on what we used to call the left. Like, they know the difference between somebody who identifies as a kind of ACLU liberal like me, and somebody who's a more like of a modern leftist. Like, they are in tune with that, although the Republican politicians just sort of lump everybody together as communists. But online, I think they actually, in general, they're a little bit more attuned to the different species of people on the other side than you would get from the New York Times or the Washington Post, where they only really see two types of Republicans. There's Trumpers and never Trumpers. And never Trumpers to them are basically the same thing as like hashtag resistance Democrats. So if that makes any sense. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense. The nuance is astounding. And of course I'm being facetious when I say that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, speaking of caricatures, I want to return just for a second to 2 years ago. You published Hate Inc., which I thought was a phenomenal book, for the record.
Thank you.
And in the book, you sort of documented the various ways that media organizations attempt to, I guess, encourage and in some ways inculcate this kind of tribalism that we're seeing, like this team choosing. So here we are 2 years later, 2021. Trump is out of the White House. We're 2 years into COVID. It seems like we're over the worst of it, hopefully. And so, anyway, it's been 2 years since Hate Inc. Came out. Where are we at in 2021 with some of this kind of stuff?
It's funny, when I first wrote Hate Inc., I was really worried about the title because I thought it was too extreme. Like, I thought, nobody's going to believe this. That's not really descriptive of what we're. And now I think I undersold it. Like, the differences have accelerated so much in the direction that I was talking about, that just in the space of time it took to write the book, that it's almost a completely new landscape. Because when I started writing that was like 2017, late 2017, there were still some vestige of the old objective media left. I mean, I think there were still some intramural battles at places like the New York Times and the Washington Post over what the model was going to be. And by the time I finished the book, it was gone. It was completely demolished. The only model left is really that tribalistic model, the sides choosing model. And a lot of that has to do with finances. the Times has adopted kind of the same revenue model that Substack has, where I work. They're subscription based. That's where they get the bulk of their money. They have the world's biggest subscription base, and the difference there is that incentivizes them to create this kind of sense of solidarity among its followers, whereas the old New York Times had the pretense of talking to the entire world. They were the authority that everybody, from the people on the farthest left to the farthest right, they all came to the New York Times to get the definitive word on what was true and what wasn't. Now they're kind of seeking out an audience that all fits roughly in the same bubble. It's just a very new development. Very new development. Like, they didn't do that before. It's so yeah, all those tendencies have accelerated a great deal since I published that book.
Right. I mean, and I guess for those who, for our listeners who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, how far back does some of this go? You know, you've pointed to WMD as maybe the starting point of some of this, but I have some specific questions to get into about this in a bit, but just like a little soundbite here.
Yeah, I should just summarize what the thesis of the book is. So,
maybe give the thesis. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot to do that. So basically, I wanted to write a book that was like an update of Manufacturing Consent, which was the sort of great Noam Chomsky media criticism book. And I talked to him before I wrote the book, kind of got his blessing to do it. And it was based on my own experiences working in the business for 30 years now. And the big change in the media business is that in the 70s and 80s, the financial model was you were trying to get the entire audience. So if you were producing the nightly news for CBS, your strategy was you wanted to create a newscast that everybody in the family could watch. From the crazy right winger to the left wing kid who's in college, like everybody gets around the table, they all watch the news. It's kind of a unifying experience, or at least it's an inoffensive experience. What happened for a variety of reasons in the 90s and 2000s was that that no longer became feasible, and the news strategy, which was symbolized by Fox, was to let's pick a demographic and let's try to dominate the demographic rather than try to get everybody. Let's get all the conservatives, and especially the older rural to suburban conservatives who have a lot of disposable income. They'll make a great advertising base. We'll feed them news stories that they like, about the good old days being worn away. We'll scare them with pictures of non-white criminals and immigrants and liberals on campus, and that became their financial formula. It was very successful for them. But when you ask where does it go back to, I think it starts with that, because what happened organically was when all the conservatives went over to Fox and to Rush Limbaugh and places like that, everybody else kind of by default went to those other places. So, PBS, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN, they all became, almost overwhelmingly, their audience was Democratic. So if you look at the numbers by like media sort of watchdog organizations like the Pew Center, you'll see that it's almost exactly as like the numbers for Republicans at Fox are exactly the same as the number for Democrats at MSNBC. Or the New York Times. So that's where we are. It's the business model is pick an audience, feed them stuff that they're gonna like, and just keep doing it.
Right. No, I mean It's interesting to see how that's developed. Certainly in my lifetime, that's the only kind of news that I remember watching.
Which is
So I
interesting
have
to
this.
me because I meet all these people like you who don't know any other way that it's ever been, and it's so bizarre because when I was a kid and when I watched my father do the job, it was totally the opposite. So
Yeah, it's weird. I have this. I studied history. I studied history of journalism actually, but so I have like this weird nostalgia for something that I've never myself experienced.
never experienced. That's
So,
funny.
but you mentioned manufacturing consent, Noam Chomsky's work. That came out in 1988, I believe.
Mhm.
Then in 2001, Joan Didion wrote Political Fictions, which covered a lot of the same kind of stuff and was really quite interesting for me to read. I think I have the quote here. She talked about a handful of insiders that invent year in and year out the narrative of public life. So this weird amalgam of policy people, media people, federal bureaucrats who sort of sit in this vertical orbit and decide what the issues are going to be, decide what people are going to be talking about, and then sort of push it out. So I guess one question to you is how organized and intentional do you see this sort of vertical being of policy advisors, journalists, media people, federal bureaucrats who sort of sit around together in this amorphous club, and decide, as Didion pointed out, what the issues are, what the issues are going to be, who quite literally invent what she called the narrative of public life. Like, who's directing this? How intentional is it? I guess, the low level guy in the 22-year-old intern at CNN is not necessarily taking calls from the White House, and being told what story to run. At least I would hope not.
Right.
So I think a lot of people, a lot of people within media, particularly lower level people, may not even be aware that it's happening, or if they are aware, they just have a vague sense of, you know, there is some kind of directive coming from up top, but we don't really know where or what form it takes. But I guess how intentional and organized is this
Blob.
gang
Yeah.
of yeah, this blob of people inventing the narrative of public life.
So I think I struggled with this for a long time because at the level of reporters, I mean, there's no like commissar who comes down and like gives you the order on what the narrative of the day is. That stuff is largely internalized. Uh, it comes from a lifetime of interacting with editors. So by the time you get to the point of um, being in a position to write a front page story for the New York Times or a cover story for Rolling Stone in my case, or whatever, you've already internalized the values of the business to the point where what's a story they like and what's a story they don't like. Now, what was fascinating for me as a young reporter when I was first going out, particularly on the presidential campaign story, because I got to I was on the bus, right? Like
Yeah.
there really is a bus,
Yeah.
or a plane, and I would sit with people who were the most influential political reporters in the country, and I would listen to them talk about which candidates they were going to decide to take seriously and which ones they were going to describe as fringe, which ones they were going to describe as electable, which ones they liked, which ones they didn't like, which ones um, they were already settling ahead of time on the themes that were likely, like the way they would frame it is they would be talking amongst themselves about, well, here's what's going to hurt this candidate or that candidate, right? They would say things like, well, Dean is he's too pointed, he's too far to the left. This is Howard Dean they're talking about in
Yeah.
2004,
Yeah.
right? So, and I remember this because I was invited on this tour around the country with the Dean campaign. It was called the Grassroots Express, where Howard Dean was trying to introduce himself to the National Press Corps and was kind of hoping to get on a solid footing with the reporters by giving them a lot of personal access. But on the very first day of the trip, in the back of the plane, I was listening to all the reporters talking about all the things they were going to, all the different ways they were going to beat the crap out of the guy. And the reasons basically weren't that he was, well, there were, mainly it was because he was a critic of the war, but the other really big thing that he had done to arouse the ire of the political establishment was that he had an alternative way of raising money that was not acceptable. Like, he was going directly to people through the internet. This was a new thing at the time. Bernie did it
Right.
very successfully in
Grassroots.
2020. Yeah, exactly. That had never been done before because and the reason that's significant is because the donors had always had complete control over the candidates. Like, if you couldn't get all the big donors, you weren't going to be the nominee. That's just the way it worked. Dean
Right.
was actually leading in the polls without getting any of those big donors, which was a major no-no. So the reporters, they didn't frame it in those terms, but they were talking amongst themselves saying, yeah, I think he's just too far to the left. And then I would watch them interacting with him throughout the rest of the trip, and 50 times a day he would get these questions like, so do you think you're too far left for the average American? And he would answer it fine for like the first 100 times, and then eventually he would start to lose his patience, and then they would say, see, he's got a personality problem. And that's how they do it, like it's like a high school. It's a bunch of people get together and they just kind of decide that some people are cool, some people aren't, and they got very addicted to this power to decide who gets to be in and who gets to be out. And that's
Right.
what was so fascinating about Trump, is that they decided right away that he was unacceptable and he won anyway. And that's why I think that's one of the reasons they can't stand him so much.
Yeah. I mean, he really turned the tables on a lot of things. But I guess, I was, I have to ask, like, half facetiously, hearing some of this, it makes you think. I guess my one question to you is, like, do we live in a country with kingmakers?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and they brag openly about it. I mean, go back to 2008. You'll see the now disgraced Mark Halperin, who used to be ABC's big campaign writer. He wrote this thing called The Note, and it was the big insider destination. Like, if you wanted to know what the theme of campaign coverage was going to be that day, you clicked on The Note every morning. And Halperin used to write about this thing he called the Gang of 500. And his whole thesis was that 500 people controlled America. It's very similar to what you were talking about with Joan Didion. Basically, he said they were lobbyists, donors, journalists, politicians, heads of think tanks, and those were the people who, before the election process started, already had everything essentially lined up, and they were the deciders, and it was sort of the job of the campaign reporters to express the will of the Gang of 500. And he bragged a lot about how he had almost all of them on his Rolodex, and so they were very openly celebrating their king-making role, right? And they had, and this is one of the things that it gets back to one of your first questions. the degree to which people were so deeply annoyed by that, like the inability to realize that people would read that and think, fuck you, I'm not gonna like, listen to what you're saying after you you brag about something like that. They just didn't get it. They thought it was cool that they were kind of assuming that position. Um and yeah, but I think again the king making you know facility, it broke down under Trump. It just stopped working.
Right. Right. I was watching an episode of Succession recently.
Mm,
I don't know if you watch the TV show. And there was, some sort of little political secret conference for Republican donors. And they sort of jokingly called the conference like picking our next president, which is they're picking the Republican nominee.
yeah.
But
No,
this. Sorry,
they,
go
they
ahead.
they had they had a thing called the invisible primary. I don't know if you ever read about that. There was a book called.
No, no. What? Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
There's even a book. I think there's even a book called The Invisible Primary, and it's
Oh,
based.
okay.
Yeah, it's based on the idea that um, the nominee is basically chosen before the formal election
RNC, yeah,
process
all that stuff.
starts,
Yeah.
and it's all about lining up the donors, the party leaders, and the major figures in the media. Uh, and if you go back and look, you'll see people referencing the winner of the invisible primary. Um, and in 2016, that was Jeb Bush, and he of course got 3 delegates total. So it was a complete breakdown of that system. But
Right.
but they believed very implicitly in this idea that if you get these 3 big players on board, and they give 150 or 200 million dollars to the right candidate, then basically it's decided. Like every now and then there's a contest between 2 candidates who are essentially identical policy wise, and they're adjudicating small differences between what the population likes, like between Clinton and Obama in 2008. But for the most part, uh, for the most part, the invisible primary was very predictive until it wasn't.
Right. Right. Um, I guess harkening back to some of your other previous work, I was asking about how Hate Inc. is playing out today. 11 years before you wrote Hate Inc., you wrote The Great Derangement. And it seems that there was another great derangement which tore through America in 2016 with the election of Trump. And then again in 2020 with a lot of the discourse around the Black Lives Matter protests. So I guess to begin with, could you define what you mean by the great derangement, and then talk a little bit about how you see that playing out today, more than a decade after you wrote the initial book?
Yeah, it's funny. Normally, my predictive powers are pretty weak. Like I have a tremendous history of picking the wrong candidates to win elections and everything like that.
Yeah.
But with the Great Derangement, basically what I was drawing upon the experience of covering presidential campaigns, among other things, and I was noticing that there was this increasing problem about authority with information. So because people no longer trusted the mainstream press as much as they had previously, increasingly Democrats and Republicans especially were not, when they had arguments, the problem wasn't so much that they disagreed with each other. The problem was that they weren't arguing with the same sets of facts. Like
Right. Right.
they were getting their information with the internet. They were now essentially reality shopping, and they were getting their information in a way that was unusual. Like, again, back in the 70s, everybody was watching the same three networks. So even if they disagreed with one another, they had a commonly debated set of facts. Now that started to disappear in 2008, and it accelerated every time, especially every time the national media did something that kind of was sort of off-putting, like the WMD episode. It pushed people further and further away. And I think now by 2016 and 2020, basically most of America inhabits separate factual universes. Like we mostly don't believe the same stuff. What's interesting about that, particularly interesting about that, is that a lot of what the right is reading versus what people on the center left are reading, it's not like one side's reading facts and one side is reading lies. It's just, in many cases, they're just reading different facts. And so the problem with that is that you just end up with a population that is increasingly dug in, doesn't have a common frame of reference, and it makes politics extremely difficult because people don't really know how to talk to one another anymore.
Right. No, I mean, I wrote a column on this recently, actually, or that covered in part some of this. I was the column was called "Noble Intentions, Counterproductive Results," and it was in general about how Republicans and Democrats want, the same end result in general, but they have very different ways of getting there. And so, you look at something like police brutality, for example. You can sort of paint statistics in any way you want. I know you wrote a whole book on the Eric Garner situation, but if you really want to save Black lives, perhaps pulling police out of communities that need it most isn't the most wise thing to do. Like shocking idea. But the statistics of police brutality, when you look at, like, again, these terms used to mean something, but left versus right media outlets, you are very much dealing with a different set of facts. It's the same data, just presented in different ways. So totally understand where you're coming from on that one.
Yeah, and the police brutality issue is a classic example of how you can tell almost any story you want looking at the data without lying, and it's very frustrating because I think a guiding principle that's pretty consistent and pretty universally true in almost all cases is that most problems are extremely complicated, and it's very rare that one side is all right and one side is all wrong. With the policing issue, I was very frustrated after the George Floyd incident because I'd spent years and years of my life covering that problem, and a major reason that we have a lot of police brutality incidents is because we have a really, really stupid system of policing in this country that's based upon a strategy of just stopping tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people for basically no reason at all and searching them on the street. And because we've artificially heightened the amount of contact between the police and the population, a statistically larger amount of those contacts goes wrong and people get killed. And this is one of the things that you talk to both Republicans and liberals, they will both have a place of agreement there. They'll be like, oh yeah, you're right, like that is stupid, maybe we could fix that. But rather than focusing on the fixable issues in policing, we, the way the media reports stuff, it's just designed to make people emotional and get them upset and make it harder and harder to come up with solutions that are satisfactory. And you talk about pulling police out of inner city neighborhoods. That's just bad reporting, because if you go to tough neighborhoods in American cities, um, you know, almost, I would say, like, there's a majority of the people in these neighborhoods actually want a more visible police presence. They don't want more cops
Oh, yeah.
necessarily, right? But they they
Mm,
they, they want they want the police they want police to be seen more, so that there's like
sure.
less drug dealing, there's less violence on the street, that kind of stuff. They want to be able to go back and forth to their jobs without being, hassled, that sort of thing. But that's taboo to say in kind of like center left media now. So,
Yeah.
there's this illusion that people have this feeling about it based on, I don't know, something they read in school. I mean, I don't know. It's very frustrating.
It is absolutely frustrating, and funny is probably not the right word, but I think it's deeply unsettling, I guess, that there seems to be a disconnect between policymakers and the people on whom the policies are being enacted. You have uh, oftentimes you have these white liberals with lofty ideas who want to speak for, the inner city black populations, and it's like, why don't we actually ask people what they want instead of,
Yeah,
deciding for them.
absolutely.
um
The last people you should ask about policing issues are people who live in towns that don't have policing problems. You know,
right. Or live on the other side of town,
right?
it's like, or live nowhere, no, not even in the same state,
Right.
but who suddenly become experts when it comes time to make a policy. They suddenly become the most like knowledgeable, qualified, 6 PhDs
Yeah, I
on the
know.
subject. It's
I know.
yeah.
Yeah.
But we can move past this issue. Otherwise, I mean, we could talk about this for hours. And you've written about this for years. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, I guess, you spent a fair bit of time in the Soviet Union. And you wrote the book. The Exile came out of that. Reminded me in some ways of Ben Mesrick wrote this book called The Rise of the Oligarchs.
Mhm.
Like, I forget what the title after the colon is, but it was basically about,
It's probably
posts.
alliterative, something, something, and something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. There were three, uh so yeah, with a
Crisis,
catchy title.
coalition, and something. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Something with alliteration that sounded nice.
Yeah.
But you were there in the in the Soviet Union. And so, as I'm sure you're aware, in 1990, Charles Krauthammer wrote that famous unipolar moment piece, or he coined the term unipolar moment. We are no longer living in a world where there's a contest for ideological hegemony, where now there is one world superpower and the other has collapsed. So, in terms of the unipolar moment, where are we today in terms of global geopolitics? A lot of people have observed the decline of American empire. In fact, we ran an article on this for Quillette the other day by Andrew Roberts, who's a British historian. But I mean, Afghanistan is one example. We have China screwing around in Taiwan, Iran screwing around with the bomb, Russia screwing around with Ukraine. And so it seems that Afghanistan, for a lot of Americans, was a deeply unsettling moment, in that it sort of pierced this veil of America being
Competent.
the predominant, yeah, well, competent for one, but like a global force in the world that could be sort of trusted, I guess, or competent is a good word, because whether you think it's good or bad, what America is doing, like to a large degree, throughout the 20th century, their foreign policy was generally, they achieved a lot of their policy aims. We don't need to get into a lot of the fuckery that went on in Latin America,
Right.
in the Cold War. But just to pair back, I don't mean to go on for too long. 1990, Charles Krauthammer wrote about the unipolar moment. Where are we today in terms of global geopolitics and the contest of ideological hegemony?
Yeah. I recently read a book by this very nutty dead person named James Burnham. I think it was
Yeah, no,
called
I'm familiar. I know the
the
guy.
Managerial Revolution. I think it was called.
He
Had it.
gamed out all these World War 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
I know
and
Burnham.
it had an introduction by Orwell, um, but his core thesis was really interesting. In between being like stupendously wrong about many things, he predicted a future that was kind of fascinating, where um, the world would devolve into these kind of super states that were neither capitalist nor socialist. They would be dominated by a managerial class, um, and there would be a never-ending kind of contest between super states that would never be able to quite overtake one another. Um,
Right.
One would be based in America, one would be based in Europe, and one would be based in Asia. Now, that's remarkably
Russia, China,
similar.
and the US.
Right, yeah,
Well,
exactly.
maybe not, but yeah.
Or Europe, China, and the US. Like, I
Yeah,
don't know. I
yeah,
don't know
not
exactly
Russia.
how you would do it. Russia to me almost doesn't matter, because it's
No, I misspoke.
yeah, because it's such a small economic power. But to me that's more descriptive than what the neoconservatives thought was going to happen after 1990. I mean, the people like Bill Kristol
Mm,
from the Weekly Standard in the 90s were writing about something they call benevolent hegemony, or
yeah,
hegemony, or however you pronounce that,
yeah,
where the whole idea was, well, now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, that this is not the time to indulge in a peace dividend. This is the time to put our foot on the gas pedal and sort of expand American influence to as many places as we can. I think they tried to do that, and what we found is that that resulted in a lot of the more spectacular failures of American foreign policy of late, including Afghanistan and Iraq. That, but America still is this massively powerful country that has 800 military bases around the world, and just almost unlimited supplies of weapons, and we're not going away anytime soon. Neither is China, neither is Europe. But these countries they're not really classically democracies. They're not really, I mean, we're just headed into this weird place.
What do you mean by that? Classically What do you just
I just think the United States in particular is evolving in this kind of more authoritarian direction that is farther and farther away from the democratic ideal that we were all sort of raised to believe in growing up, and we're starting to more and more resemble the societies that we once reviled, like China, that has mass surveillance and a social credit system and that sort of thing. So my pessimistic view on all this is that we're kind of evolving in the direction of becoming a less than free super state. I hope that's not true, but it feels like it.
Shifting gears away from some of the more political stuff and into questions sort of about the American identity. Um, self-invention seems to be like foundational to the American identity. You know, we think about Alexander Hamilton, the Great Gatsby. I personally, I think about like Little Richard or even something like Motley Crue. Um, but
I
yeah, I
love
mean,
Motley
like,
Crue.
I mean, I did research at Princeton on Motley Crue. It just to sort of
That's really funny.
throw some spice into the history department. But
I've got a Crue shirt somewhere here. So yeah.
yeah, gotta love Nikki, Vince, Tommy, Tommy and Mick. But you know, this concept of radical self-invention can go askew sometimes. And you know, one example I think of is the Elizabeth Holmes example, of someone who, you know, she wants to sort of create her own conception of self, but it goes awry, and she sort of ventures into illegality. I mean, you know, Gatsby was a bootlegger. A lot of that was based on illegality as well. But you have a current book now on drug dealers, the business secrets of drug dealing, and so I think about the American dream gone awry. Like, are people trying to hack the American dream? Are people disrupting, for lack of a
That's
better
a good
word,
question.
the
That's a great
American
question.
dream? Yeah. So like, I mean, self-invention is it's foundational to the American identity, but where does it go awry, particularly in relation to you know, this book that you have out now?
Yeah, so it's funny. You know, you mentioned Elizabeth Holmes. Obviously, we have a great and very rich history of con artists in America. Uh, and but um, you know, I would say where I used to live before in Russia, they have an even richer history of that. Like, there's a famous story about after the War of 1812, a Russian officer who had made it all the way to France um, during the war runs into another Russian who had just come from Russia, and he said, like, well, what are they doing back in the motherland? And his answer is stealing. And that, it sounds better in Russian, but basically that kind of sums up the Russian character. They're like, you know, all the books that I loved about Russian literature, like Dead Souls, they're about con artists. It's like something that's deeply embedded in the Russian character is being really good at ripping people off. Whereas the American legend is much more about like, it's tied to performance in addition to hucksterism, right? So like the P.T. Barnum concept of there's a sucker born every minute, but you got to put a show on too, right? Like, you know,
Yeah.
you got to earn it a little bit. Like that's part of the American idea is we don't celebrate the person who just flat out steals. We celebrate the person who is a combination of a con artist and somebody who is able to deliver the goods, right? And I I think I spent a lot of time in 2008 or after 2008 writing about the mortgage-backed securities thing, which was another massive con artistry story. You know, really it was a Ponzi scheme, which was sort of an American invention also. And but we don't celebrate those people. Like those people they're supposed to be villains in the American story, right? Like and the people we do celebrate are the people who you know, who kind of defy expectations, go against the grain, but make something of themselves that's kind of positive and lasting and cool. And but yeah, I think you're right. I think there's been like this shift in sort of pessimism about what the American dream is. Like people don't really believe it, so all they really focus on is, well, how do I get the money, you know? And
It becomes reduced. The whole concept of upward social mobility becomes reduced to just, you know, cash in a duffel bag,
Right.
or just literally just the money.
Right, yeah, and
Yeah,
that's what Scarface was like. The movie Scarface was sort of about that, right? It's like, he comes to America and he loves it, right? Like everything about it just sort of clicks with his personality. Um, and of course he's a drug dealer, uh, but he's still got to build something, right? And that's still different from this idea of doing what the banks did in 2008, which is just coming up with an algorithmic formula for just stealing off the top 30% of everybody's wealth. Like, that's I don't see that as being in the American tradition. Like that's just pessimism. You know what I mean? That's not P.T. Barnum. That's that's something really depressing. It's you get to that mindset by not believing that there's any future, so you might as well just steal what's left. And I having covered a lot of American industry for the last 20 years, you see this progressively more and more short-term kind of thinking that has infected um, American business. And that's really depressing to me because, we also have this amazing history of just inventing stuff that changes the world, and we still do that. Um, but yeah, I think it's in competition with that pessimism too.
yeah, certainly. I mean, on the other hand, though, a question is like the this growth of the idea that you can hack, or that you can hack the American dream, or that you can short circuit it or jump the queue, basically. Social mobility queue jumping is a term that I use sometimes.
Right.
There used to
Well, that's
be
the
an I
Gatsby theme, right?
well
Like,
that yeah, it is the Gatsby theme. I have a column coming out about this, actually, but
that's interesting.
it's there was for a long time an understanding that social mobility did not happen in one generation, that social mobility, upward social mobility anyway, would generally take, it would generally take 2 or 3 generations. Parents come over, they're immigrants, they work really hard, and they, like they value education quite highly for the kids. The kids do a little bit better, plus they have their education behind them, set up a business, whatever, make their money, and then their children 2 generations later have realized the American dream, or really kicked themselves up the social mobility ladder. Then I don't really know where this began. I might point to the 1980s, when perhaps Wall Street, and Gordon Gecko and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah,
honestly,
financialization.
yeah, financialization. I don't know where it began, but there became. I don't necessarily want to say an impatience, but there became an idea that social mobility was not something that you necessarily had to wait 2 or 3 generations for, or that you would sort of had to, like, put in the time, blood, sweat, and tears into. Is something that could be hacked not only within one generation, but within a matter of years.
Or minutes now, like,
Yeah, with NFTs and crypto and all this shit.
yeah.
Um,
No, I think that's right. I think if you look at the difference between somebody like Mitt Romney and his dad, right?
mm,
So, Mitt Romney's father obviously was the head of AMC Motors. So classic American capitalist, built factories at a time when the relationship between banking and industry was, banks were there to finance the factories, that were there to finance the improvements that were needed. Um, the companies would make money, a rising tide would sort of lift all boats, and you growth in one area couldn't exist without everybody kind of growing a little bit, right?
mm,
Mitt Romney's, his generation came along, and they realized, this financialization generation came along, and they realized, like, we actually don't need growth, like real on the ground, brick and mortar growth to get massively rich overnight. This was the innovation of the kind of Mike Milken generation, which is we can finance takeovers, we can do private equity deals. I mean, the what Romney ended up doing at Bain Capital was basically the same thing that Gordon Gekko was doing in Wall Street. These private equity hostile takeovers of companies where you're taking borrowed money to take over a company, you plunder it for all of its assets, you force the company to be on the hook for the money that you borrowed, and then everybody walks away rich without actually having to do anything. You don't have to build anything. You can just take financial engineering and get rich through a series of transactions. Like transactions becomes the financial transactions becomes the thing instead of making products. That's what we make now. We make transactions rather than products. And yeah, I think that changed the mentality of this country. I think that was part of what led to 2008. I can't tell you how many people I met when I was covering the mortgage thing who saw Wall Street when they were growing up and thought Gekko was supposed to be the hero of the movie. And so yeah, I think that's this idea that you can jump the line, you don't have to work hard.
Well, they are working hard.
They're working hard,
you don't have to the length.
The length, right? Yeah, you don't, or you don't have to. You don't have to do the kind of thing you were talking about before, the process that took so long, that generational deal. No, you can get it in one fell swoop now, and yeah, I think that's a negative development in our history, and certainly kind of responsible for some of the populist rage that you see. Like if you look at phenomena like GameStop, right, where you have all these people who are somewhere between 25 and 35 or 25 and 40, and they they grew up with this being told that, oh yeah, you have to kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work your way up the chain, and that's how you make the money. And then they look at Wall Street and they see that no, that's actually not how it really works. Like you can make money, a fortune overnight, and if you screw up, you get bailed out by the government because somebody or whatever it is. And they think that's incredibly unfair, and so that's why they're.
It's a bit of a reductive. It's slightly more complicated than that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of them think that. I mean, I think a lot of the people.
The GameStop people, or the
GameStop people.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Sure.
Yeah, and so there's this attitude out there that like, well, if they're gonna do that, if they're gonna jump the line, if the whole system is rigged, then I might as well, try to rig it for myself, and I'm a little bit sympathetic to that, but it's depressing at the same time. So,
it is depressing. I'm not up on what Mitt Romney was doing at Bain Capital.
He's a private equity guy, so
he's but I mean, there's private equity is not inherently a bad thing. I mean, it can be a great thing.
It can be, but mostly, but that's like, for instance, I covered what Bain did with KB Toys in Western Massachusetts. So, like, they went out to investors, they borrowed a ton of money, they took over a company that wasn't doing too badly. It was having some issues, but it wasn't like a disaster. And they immediately imposed massive fees on the company for the privilege of being managed by a company that it didn't want to be taken over by. I mean, I wrote a story about this, and fairly soon the company was in much more dire straits. Now, Bain wins in that situation because the way that is set up, it doesn't really matter whether the company succeeds or not. They still make the money.
Right.
So that's one of the things that the sort of private equity takeover. Yes, it can turn around companies that are dysfunctional, but that's not a prerequisite for the private equity company making money.
Right.
So
No, I did understood. I mean, and it makes sense. I'm gonna have to go back and read some of your old pieces. I'm unfamiliar with this, but like in general, I sort of understand like, stripping down a company for parts and just like financialization, just producing, you know, uh, as you said before, shareholder dividends rather than real
right. I
products.
mean, it's
But
fundamentally different from what he did with like Staples. Staples was like a traditional like venture capital, let's start a new business
yeah.
kind of a thing. So anyway, we don't have to go there.
But no. Well, I want to go to the other end of the spectrum, which is like drug dealing,
Uh-huh.
or hoaxsters, hucksters, all of it, because that's also like an attempt to short circuit the American dream a little bit, or at least Q jump. um, and you've written this book now about it. So maybe tell us a little bit about that in relation to American identity, self invention, this
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
so this was a really fun book. I there was somebody I knew who I have an anonymous co-author who was a friend of mine, who I knew in another thing, or whom I knew, I guess, in another capacity for years, and without guessing that he had a secret life. He had been kind of a drug kingpin. He dealt marijuana, but he had been doing it on a pretty enormous scale for years and years and years. And uh, he had never been caught, never been busted for drugs, even once in his life. And he had a really, really interesting story to tell about all the rules that he had developed over the years for avoiding getting caught. And so the book ends up being kind of a how-to guide to making money illegally in this country. But what's interesting about it is that he he's sort of an arch capitalist character. It's very similar to Scarface, except that he's, I think, a more appealing character. He he doesn't really see a difference between what he does and what you know Goldman Sachs or some other company does. If you when marijuana starts to become legal in California, he realizes that in order to become part of the club, in order to become a legal regulated marijuana dealer, he has to
Mm,
essentially do the same thing that he would have done as an illegal drug dealer, which is pay a fee to whoever the regional drug lord in the area it was
right.
to operate. And so it's kind of a book about what capitalism looks like to somebody who's viewing it from the street level.
It's a
It's
perverse
Yeah,
rendition of the American dream. Yeah.
yeah,
It's
exactly. It's dark, but it's funny.
yeah.
He's a very funny character. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess part of the question is, other than for the sake of great literature, why why would he spill the beans? I mean, he's got the secret sauce, the good stuff.
Well,
Why should
he
why should
had
we be privy to this?
he had to get out for a reason that's kind of hard to explain.
Then we don't need to get into it, Matt. That's all right.
No, it's okay. Basically, he was going to get caught if he kept going, was what happened. And so and he didn't want to do time. He didn't want to have to go through all that. So he got out, and but he had a great story to tell, and we were friends, and we sort of figured that it would be cool to write this book. One of the things that he talked about was that a lot of drug dealers don't know how to do what they do. They get most of their knowledge from movies, and that he sort of wanted it almost as a public service, to
A
make to
public
write the
service.
book.
Yes.
Yeah,
How to a nice a listicle. It's like a BuzzFeed article.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. No, it comes out in a way that's funny. I think, you know.
mm,
I mean, there's like a deep irony to the whole thing, and I did it because I thought it would make kind of a funny, almost like a funny novel.
mm.
Um, and it might, as a satirical commentary on like kind of American 20th century or 21st century American capitalism. It kind of works, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why we did it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. A fascinating topic. I will say, my friend, you certainly have range from writing about, following around Trump on the campaign trail to writing about post Soviet Russia to writing about the business secrets of drug dealing.
Well, I'm
There's
also
few
old, so
areas.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But nah, I mean, there's few areas that you don't touch, which is it's good. I mean, and to that end, I, as well as many others, when I think of you, I think about Hunter Thompson. Like, you've often been compared to Hunter Thompson. I know you spoke at Gonzo Fest in Louisville a couple years ago.
And I wrote the
So
introduction to the new Fear and Loathing.
really,
The Fear and
really,
Loathing on the campaign trail, yeah.
okay, yeah.
Hmm.
I didn't know that. Well, I'm gonna have to get a copy.
Yeah, that was cool. That was a highlight. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess my question to you is, um, what I wrote my thesis at Princeton about this, so I have my own opinion, but I'm interested in yours. What was the legacy of Hunter Thompson on the institution of journalism and on American popular culture at large?
See, I look at Hunter Thompson as being more like a great fiction writer um than as somebody who had a really profound influence on journal. He did, obviously, because he's been imitated by everybody, not successfully, including me.
Hmm.
Um, we all, whether we want to or not, we all end up trying to imitate him because he had such a way with words. But he was uh, a sort of a uniquely gifted writer. It's just, some people are just born with this ability to create um, an instantly relatable narrator, and he had this amazing way of sort of rendering ordinary situations, um,
Extraordinary.
three and
Yeah.
almost four-dimensional. You know what I mean? Like his
Yeah.
characters were just sort of uh they were unforgettable, and they were hilarious. Like the humor is so I like, for me, like books like Fear and Loathing and on the campaign trail, they're structured like sort of epic comic novels, like The Castle or The Trial. Like if you actually
Hmm.
read it from that point of view, it's a person, it's a sane person trapped in a universe of stupidities and inanities, who is never going to find the great answer, even though he wants to desperately, but the reader knows it's never going to happen. So it's written like a classic comedy, and he was just unbelievably brilliant. It's funny for me because I had the same job as him, and I get compared to him all the time, but not even
What, for Rolling
remotely
Stone?
this. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I covered the same beat. I even had an illustrator who illustrated a little bit like Ralph Steadman in a way.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you work for Jan Wenner?
I did, yeah.
At Rolling
Mhm.
Stone. Yeah.
Yeah. I know I worked for a bunch of the people who I worked for people who edited on her. So,
Mhm.
um, but not
A
even remotely
monumental
this.
task.
Yeah. Oh my God.
to
Yeah.
editing Hunter Thompson. Oh
Some
my
of those
God.
stories are unbelievable. They're, yeah.
Just
He,
sending it out how you would send in, random fax pages at 3 a.m. He would demand to have his room stocked with all kinds of supplies.
yeah, where
But
they would have to force a big amphetamine pill down his mouth while he was unconscious to wake him up.
yeah,
Um,
I haven't heard about that one, but
yeah, that was
wouldn't
an
be
interesting
surprised.
story.
Yeah.
Uh, but but no, I mean he not even the same like sort of type of writer. I'm not even the same type of writer as him. He's much more like a Mark Twain or somebody like that. Like, you know,
I've never
it
heard
just
that
so happened.
comparison.
Well, no, I mean,
But
think about how much you identify with the narrator in a Mark Twain.
yeah, like
Uh,
Huckleberry Finn or like
yeah,
yeah, sure.
or any of his essays, like, you know, the awful German language or Fenimore Cooper's literary offenses. Like, you know, he
Yeah.
grabs you in the same way, and Thompson is sort of unique in that respect. Um, so
He's an
what's
ordinary guy. The narrator is an ordinary guy, but I mean, he's 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 not really ordinary, but he's an awful word to use, but definitely relatable. Like we can all like
he,
identify with him a little bit.
absolutely, and this is one of the things that like a lot of commentators get wrong about him. When he died, there were all these sort of detractors who said, like, you know, he was this talentless nobody who kind of um who attracted young people because he was taking lots of drugs, and he was you know, sort of a party animal, right, which was, you know, which was sort of over celebrated. But that's not what people are connecting with in his books. They're connecting with like um the earnest person who's just sort of desperately trying to find uh you know, the answer, and never quite can, which is something everybody can relate to. Like
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
that quest for, you know,
Meaning. There's a
for,
perennial quest for meaning.
for meaning, yeah, the great shark hunt, right, like the, or the
Yeah.
savior or whatever it is. And he never gets there, but he's just so relatable. You just like him, and you're right there with him, you know. And so he was unique in that respect.
He absolutely was one of, I think, the greats, certainly of the 20th century. It's funny, when I was writing my thesis, I wrote the thesis was called like it was on literary journalism. So I looked at Hunter Thompson, John Didion, and George Plimpton.
Hmm.
And I have to say, Hunter was I use his first name as if I knew him personally. So I did I talked to people who knew him, but he was one of the most fun to read. I really enjoyed reading George Plimpton and Joan Didion. Um, but the voice, it's the voice. It's like I remember during lockdown, during the first lockdown here in Australia, I was living out in this some I wouldn't use remote, but basically this town that's like 6 hours up the coast of Sydney, a very small town. I'm from New York, it's like different. So I would, um, suburban, deeply suburban.
Hmm.
But I would go for runs every morning. And I remember listening to Fear and Loathing narrated, and I'd read the book before, but when I listened to this book narrated, I was like, Jesus, this guy he's angry. And I certainly, I remember when I wrote my own book, I would think to myself sometimes, how would Hunter say this? And then I sort of like grew out of that a little bit, and I was like, no, just develop your own voice. But
Yeah.
when I went back to edit it every now and then, I would think like, how can we pile on the adjectives or like draw in some crazy cultural references that no one would think of. I almost think of what he was doing. It's a very crude metaphor, but almost sort of like in the way that when you listen to a really good rap song, you think like, how did they draw connections between these things? Um,
Right. Right.
Hunter did. He drew these just wild connections. Just very compelling descriptive language, I guess
Yeah,
I would
no,
say.
absolutely. And he was drawing from, different kinds of writers who weren't journalists, and kind of stealing. I mean, he does what every writer does. He steals from all of his favorite writers, you know, made it into a big mishmash. His technique of kind of ending sentences with ellipses and everything. Like he got that because he read a lot of Celine. Um, he liked Nelson Algren. I don't really see a lot of Algren in his books, but apparently it was in there. But he's an example. A lot of people ask this question of like, can you teach somebody to be a great writer, or can you get there by repetition and all that? And to a limited extent, I think you can, but you really also just have to be born with it. Like some of those word choices, that's God given to me. And he was at the top of my list in terms of um, people who were just totally original and impossible to imitate, I would say.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Among Americans
Um,
anyway. Yeah.
yeah, not necessarily a bad thing though. I think it's okay to have, great celebrated figures, and we can acknowledge them for their flaws and whatever, but we don't necessarily need another Hunter Thompson. People say if only Hunter were around today. We have great historical figures, literary figures, political figures, even though a little bit more rare, who have an impact in their time. And when they die, we can draw on the lessons of history and appreciate them. But um, I think back to Nick Carraway and Gatsby, just imploring Gatsby's character, saying, "Look, Jay, you can't repeat the past." And Gatsby says, "Of course you can, of course you can." So when I see people trying to imitate other writers or imitate past artists or politicians or musicians, even like I look at some of the you know, I don't want to call them out by name, but I look there are a few bands today trying to like be Motley Crue in 2021, and the fact of the matter is, it doesn't play. It's just like kitschy and absurd. I'm talking about Steel Panther, but if if you're familiar with them, but uh, just appreciate things for what they were, let them go. Anyway, I want to ask you one last question here,
Sure.
Matt, and then I'll let you go. But you know, uh Ghislaine Maxwell's on trial now, or Ghislaine, can never pronounce it.
I think it's Jelaine.
Ghislaine, yeah. So Ghislaine Maxwell is on trial now. Obviously, there was the whole Epstein affair. Not so long ago, and then the subsequent Netflix documentary. So this is a very open-ended question, but because you're a prescient cultural observer, I guess I just want to, and if you don't want to comment on this, that's fine. But I guess I just want to ask, what can we take away from this? What should we take away from this? Like, what did you personally take away from the Epstein affair, and now the Ghislaine trial, even though it's not over?
I mean, the Epstein affair is. I mean, first of all, it should have been fatal to you know a whole host of politicians, and wasn't. Um, the way that his death was reported was comical in the degree to which it was just not believable. um
Right.
and I don't know. I've never been like really conspiratorial. I've always really believed that most of the conspiracies in American life are sort of banal and out in the open. Like that's sort of the key to understanding America, is that most of the ways that society is rigged are unhidden. They're just boring and bureaucratic, and
Yeah.
and the public just doesn't have the patience to deal with it. This Epstein story has shaken my faith in that model of how America works, though, because it's 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 impossible to explain, in any way that's satisfactory, unless unless there's some kind of angle to it that involves a level of what's the way of putting it? A level of intrusion by the
Theorizing, speculation.
well, no,
sorry.
Involves a level of involvement in American public affairs by the intelligence services that, to a degree that I would never have thought possible before. Like just the manipulation of the news media, the the way that this person who should have gone away forever, essentially got off, the death that is so obviously, or it just doesn't really feel like a suicide to me. I'm sorry. Like, and I'm not a big believer. I hate conspiracy stories, but this one feels like a conspiracy story. It feels, it feels like it speaks to it's something that we haven't been told about how the world works, and so I'm kind of fascinated by it.
I'm fascinated by it too. I think I can't remember if it was Rolling Stone. I think it was Rolling Stone that ran some kind of piece about the espionage, the potential espionage element in this. It was not in a lot of publications.
It was Vanity Fair.
It was Vanity. Yeah. Okay. But anyway, that wraps up the podcast.